Well, welcome to Midsummer's Eve. In the Northern Hemisphere, this is a time for the wonderful celebration of the longest day of the year and the shortest night. This is the beginning of summer, and for many, the most joyous night of the year. It is a time for feasting and friendship and storytelling, and later leaping over the solstice fire to lose the problems and bugs that have accumulated since last winter, or perhaps even since last Midsummer's Eve. I will talk shortly more of this. It's also a time to encourage appropriate days of sunlight and encourage the rains to make the coming of the harvest bountiful. Now, my wife and I held our first Midsummer's Eve celebration with friends at our place at the top of Lost Canyon Road in 1972. We still have the notes. We've missed a few years because of snow, even at Midsummer's Eve, and more frequently fire danger. Now, about 3 years ago, the place became a part of the Trust for Public Lands, much of the place, not the whole. And hopefully, the exchange between the TPL and the federal government will make most all of this place that Judy and I and so many others hold very dear to our hearts, able to become a part of the National Forest. As an update, we are hoping to keep private an area of about 15 acres right around the cabin for use as a ski hut destination and for teaching and research. And this retains the potentiality for historic and wonderful events at the cabin. Now again, we really want to thank many people, and particularly for many that call and spread the word about the location and event for Midsummer's Eve. Now, Midsummer's Eve has been a celebration for many, many thousands of years as a community event. Before feasting, the tradition has been to pass along a little knowledge about the tradition and Midsummer's Eve before lighting the fire, and then after that, feasting begins. Now, first, as many know, our celebration was prompted by Neil Forsling, who visited here in Gunnison in 1971, and it was just after Judy and I acquired the cabin and land up Lost Canyon Road. And she said, we must celebrate Midsummer Night's Eve. She had begun her celebrations at her homestead in the 1930s at the south top of Casper Mountain, near the town of, or city really, of Casper in Wyoming. She was a noted painter and a very gifted storyteller, and her husband perished while getting the mail in a fall snowstorm. She raised 2 little girls far from town, and often for many months they were isolated from town, and one of those girls, daughters, was a senior captain to me in the Air Force. Now, Neil Forsling created stories of witches and elves and forest spirits for her daughters, and she shared these with the Casper community. Now the many shrines that she made up on her place and dedicated to many witches and a few wood choppers are part of a city park called Crimson Dawn in Casper. Tonight, dressed friendly witches walk around the trails, and the celebration has grown, and H.L. Mencken wrote about Neil's stories and the annual event and celebration many years ago, and recently a movie was made about her titled A Woman to Match the Mountains. Midsummer's Eve is a major feature of the Casper year. Watch for friendly witches flying over us with greetings from Crimson Dawn. Now, over Thousands of years ago, the change for spring to summer was a very notable event. Beginning in the birth of summer and carrying out death of the winter occurred in many ways. And I usually refer back as a starting point to James G. Fraser's book, The Golden Bough, which was published in 1922. Now, Fraser writes that in Bavaria villages, children carried a straw, well, really several straw effigies of the winter with pomp, and they were to be burned. Much the same thing was also done in eastern Russia, and the young folk there wear garlands of holy herbs as they jump through the fire and the smoke. In Little Russia, a stake is driven into the ground over this night and is wrapped in straw and then set on fire, and women then place birch boughs on the flame, saying, "May my flax grow as tall as this bough." Often, after they've all jumped over the fire, their cattle are also driven through the smoke to protect them from bad wizards and witches. In Prussia and Lithuania, the fires are supposed to protect against witchcraft and thunder and hail and cattle disease, especially if the cattle are driven over the place where the fire is burned. Then a big oak stake is driven into the ground and a wheel is fixed on it as a kind of an axle. And this wheel the villagers will spin faster and faster until the fire is produced by the friction. And then everyone lights a stake from the new fire to take home and relight their domestic hearths for the year. In Hungary, the Magyars do much the same thing, and they also drive their pigs through the smoke. And the Estonians on the Isle of Osel will pile brush wood around large trees. And they will tie a flag to the treetop, and then whomever was able to knock down the flag with a very long pole before the flag burned would receive especially good luck with crops and health for their farm animals. Now, it's time to light the fire, but again this year it's very dry and the fire is sort of symbolic. And after a little explanation, let us now enjoy a traditional feast. Now, the traditional Midsummer's fire has several different kinds of local wood. Some charred embers from the previous year or last fire to provide continuity, and cow pies and other materials to provide noxious smoke to drive away the dragons that are mating tonight, and fungus to please the earth, and a branch with new leaves to encourage extended summer, and maybe wishes and things to forget and leave behind from the past year. And finally, please add something of your own, if you want, for your special wishes. Usually after the fire is lit, and while it burns down to allow jumping over it for good health and good luck for the coming year, there is a Norse story. Midsummer's Eve is particularly significant in Scandinavian countries. Tonight's story is about the Norse sea dragon Jomungardr. It is pronounced many different ways. Or he's called the mighty or Midgard serpent. The greatest dragon of the Old Norse world is Jomungardr, and Jomungardr is also known, as I said, as the world serpent. And my brother prompted this story at Easter time when he told me and gave me a model of Jomundar, and it's usually on the roof over the first floor of the house in town, along with a land dragon, Fafnir. They watch over the house. Now, Jomundar is the middle child of the giantess Angerboza, or Bola, usually, and the Norse god Loki. The relationship of the Norse gods and giants is very complicated. Odin, the all-father of the gods and the wisest, did not like Loki, and most all of the giants. He took the baby Jomundar and threw him into the earth, circling ocean. There Jomundar grew so large that he surrounded the earth and was able to grasp his own tail in his mouth all the way around. And as a result, he received the name Midgard, or Earth Serpent. When he fully lets go of his tail, the world will end. Well, there's several stories about this dragon, Jomundar. The story tonight is about the dragon and is about the god Thor, a half-giant who was at war with a warlord, really, of the gods and the great giant Hymir. Now, Thor was the son of Odin and Frigga, the goddess of human wisdom. And Thor, in growing up, had several encounters with Jomundar. One was when the giant king disguised Jomundar by magic as a very colossal cat. Loki, who did not like Thor, challenged him to lift the cat. With great effort, the young Thor was able to lift this colossal cat so that 1 foot of the cat came off the ground and the earth shook. Thor and Tyr, the one-handed warlord, set out to find a kettle large enough to brew for all of the Aesir's gods at once. And there were many adventures along the way, and they finally came to a huge stone hall, really overlooking the ice-cold ocean and up dark rocky valleys. And this was a dwelling of the giant Hymir, whose wife was a terrible giantess who had 900 heads. With the help of a more friendly giantess, Thor and Tyr were hidden under one of the 8 huge cauldrons in the back of the wall, in a hall. And the two came out and greeted Hymir, and he smiled at Tyr, who was part giant, and glared so fiercely at Thor, saying, "Giant killer," that he broke a beam above the shelving for the cauldrons, and 7 were smashed by the falling beam, and then Hymir flashed in rage, and he invited Thor and Tyr, after passing the rage, to a meal, and 3 oxen were killed and roasted, and Thor ate 2, completely leaving 1 for everyone else. "We must provide a large feast tomorrow, so that we will fish for whales," said Hymir. Next morning, Hymir went down to the sea to catch a few whales for breakfast, and Thor met him and said he would like to help and join. Well, Hymir said fine, but Thor would have to get his own bait. Thor did this by springing over a wall and twisting off the head of Hymir's biggest and fiercest bull, called Heaven Bellower, with just a flick of his wrist. And the giant frowned but said nothing. And they got into the boat and pushed off, and Thor took the oars and rowed so fast Hymir felt alarmed. And Thor said he wished to fish in the deep sea so as to find monsters. Well, they were soon over the deepest sea, where Hymer said, "The Midgard serpent rests." Thor stopped rowing and baited a vast hook with the bull's head and lowered it to the bottom of the sea, while Hymer was hauling in whales, 2 at a time sometimes, on his lines. Well, Hymer caught enough whales and said they should go back before any great danger befell them. But just as he spoke, the Midgard serpent, Jormungandr, snapped at the bait, and the hook caught in his jaws, and he shook his head with such fury that Thor's hands holding the line crashed through the boat's side. They were pulled back so hard, and his feet went through the bottom of the boat. And they were being pulled so fast through the water, and Jormundar's head came into sight above the waves of the water, and for Hymer nothing could ever seem so fearful or hideous. His face turned yellow, and his giant knees knocked together. And Thor drew the monster toward the side of the boat and made ready to strike it with his huge hammer, Mjolnir. And Mjolnir was his mighty hammer that never missed the target when thrown, and always returned to his hand, Thor's hand. At that very moment, Thor whirled up to throw this hammer, and Hymer leant forward and cut the line. And the Midgard serpent sank back into the sea, but was struck lightly on the side of his head by Mjolnir, the hammer. Well, Mjolnir returned to Thor's hand, and both he and Hymer clambered back into the boat. And Hymer did not speak a word as Thor rowed the boat quickly back to land. And when the boat landed, Hymer asked Thor to carry some of the whales back to the hull and to put the boat up on the land, and Thor said, "Right willingly," and swung up the boat, and complete with its oars and whales and bilge water, and then carried all of this to the giant's house. Well, during breakfast, Hymer asked Thor to try to break his special favorite glass beaker for a saying that it would take all Thor's strength. Well, Thor picked it up and threw it against a stone pillar, which it passed right through and crashed against the stone wall. Thor picked it up, and it didn't show a scratch. And then the giantess mother of Tyr passed by, and she whispered to Thor, "Throw the glass beaker at Hymer's head. It is harder than any cup." Well, Thor swung around and threw the glass beaker at Hymer's head with all his strength, and it did fall to the floor in fragments. Hymer said, "Many good things are departing from me. Thor and Tyr, my grandson, have prevailed, and go forth with the great brewing kettle you have sought." Well, many things happened, and eventually Thor and Loki and the Midgard serpent met again, but that's another story. Now for fire jumping, and join us. It will be a great opportunity to, as I said earlier, lose some of the problems of the past and gain some opportunities into the future.